there. We're so excited to be starting a new book. Thank you for joining Shelby and me as we begin October Sky. This book is a memoir. It falls under the nonfiction genre because it is a story told by a person who lived through the events. And so today, as we start the first chapter, let's think about the characters that are being introduced. We have the main character, and then we have his parents, his brother, and his friends. And then also the setting is very important. The setting is in a coal mining town. It's very dreary, lots of dark colors. So it's definitely something we can learn from about how descriptive an author can be. And then also take into consideration the time that this book was written about. Okay, let's get started. Shelby and I are excited. The first chapter is titled Coalwood. Until I began to build and launch rockets, I didn't know my hometown was at war with itself over its children, and that my parents were locked in a kind of bloodless combat over how my brother and I would live our lives. I didn't know that if a girl broke your heart, another girl, virtuous at least in spirit, could mend it on the same night. And I didn't know that the enthalpy decrease in a converging passage could be transferred into jet kinetic energy if a divergent passage was added. The other boys discovered their own truth when we built our rockets, but those were mine. Coalwood, West Virginia, where I grew up, was built for the purpose of extracting the millions of tons of rich bituminous coal that lay beneath it. In 1957, when I was 14 years old and first began to build my rockets, there were nearly 2,000 people living in Coalwood. My father, Homer Hickman, was the mine superintendent, and our house was situated just a few hundred yards from the mine's entrance. A vertical shaft, 800 feet deep. From the window of my bedroom, I could see the black steel tower that sat over the shaft and the comings and goings of the men who worked at the mine. Another shaft with railroad tracks leading up to it was used to bring out the coal. The structure for lifting, sorting, and dumping the coal was called the tipple. Every weekday, and even on Saturday, when times were good, I could watch the black coal cars rolling beneath the tipple to receive their massive loads, and then smoke spouting locomotives straining to pull them away. All through the day, the heavy thump of the locomotive's steam pistons thundered down our narrow valleys, the town shaking to the crescendo of grinding steel as the great trains accelerated. Clouds of coal dust rose from the open cars, invading everything, seeping through windows and creeping under doors. Throughout my childhood, when I raised my blanket in the morning, I saw a black, sparkling powder float off it. My socks were always black with coal dirt when I took my shoes off at night. Our house, like every house in Coalwood, was company owned. The company charged a small monthly rent automatically deducted from the miners' pay. Some of the houses were tiny and single-storied with only 1 or 2 bedrooms. Others were big 2-story duplexes built as boarding houses for bachelor miners in the booming 1920s and later sectioned off as individual family dwellings during the Depression. Every 5 years, all the houses in Coalwood were painted a company white, which the blowing coal soon tinged gray. Usually in the spring, each family took it upon themselves to scrub the exterior of the houses with hoses and brushes. Each house in Coalwood had a fenced-off square of yard. My mother, having a larger yard than most to work with, planted a rose garden. She hauled in dirt from the mountains by the sackful, slung over her shoulder, and fertilized, watered, and manicured each bush with exceeding care. During the spring and summer, she was rewarded with bushes filled with great blood-red blossoms, as well as dainty pink and yellow buds spattered a brave color against the dense green of the heavy forest that surrounded us and the gloom of the black-gray mine just up the road. Our house was a corner where the state highway turned east toward the mine. A company-paved road went the other way to the center of town. Main Street, as it was called, ran down a valley so narrow in places that a boy with a good arm could throw a rock from one side of it to the other. Every day for the 3 years before I went to high school, I got on my bicycle in the morning with a big white canvas bag strapped over my shoulder and delivered the Bluefield Daily Telegraph down this valley, pedaling fast the Coldwood School and the rows of houses that were set along a little creek and up on the sides of the facing mountains. A mile down Main was a large hollow in the mountains formed where two creeks intersected. Here were the company offices and also the company church, a company hotel called the Clubhouse, the post office building, which also housed the company doctor and the company dentist, and the main company store, which everybody called the big store. On an overlooking hill was a turreted mansion occupied by the company general superintendent, a man sent down by our owners in Ohio to keep an eye on their assets. Main Street continued westward between two mountains, leading to clusters of miners' houses we called Middletown and Frog Level. Two forks led up mountain hollows to the colored camp of Mudhole and Snake Root. There the pavement ended and rutted dirt roads began. At the entrance to Mudhole was a tiny wooden church presided over by the Reverend Little Richard. He was dubbed Little because of his resemblance to the soul singer. Nobody at Mudhole Hollow subscribed to the paper, but whenever I had an extra one, I always left it at the little church. And over the years, the Reverend Richard and I became friends. I loved it when he had a moment to come out on the church porch and tell me a quick Bible story while I listened astride my bike, fascinated by his sonorous voice. I especially admired his description of Daniel in the lion's den, when he acted out with bug-eyed astonishment the moment Daniel's captors looked down and saw their prisoner lounging around in the pit with his arm around the head of a big lion. I laughed appreciatively. That Daniel, he knew the Lord, the Reverend summed up with a chuckle while I continued to giggle, and it made him brave. How about you, Sonny? Do you know the Lord? I had to admit, I wasn't certain about that, but the Reverend said it was all right. God looks after fools and drunks, he said with a big grin that showed off his gold front tooth. And I guess he'll look after you too, Sonny Hickam. Many a time in the days to come, when I was in trouble, I would think of Reverend Richard and his belief in God's sense of humor and his fondness for the ne'er-do-wells. It didn't make me as brave as old Daniel, but it always gave me at least a little hope the Lord would let me scrape by. The company church, the one most of the white people in town went to, was set down on a little grassy knob. In the late 1950s, it came to be presided over by a company employee, Reverend Josiah Lanier, who also happened to be a Methodist. The denomination of the preacher the company hired automatically became ours too. Before we became Methodists, I remember being a Baptist, and once for a year, some kind of Pentecostal. The Pentecostal preacher scared the women, hurling fire and brimstone and warnings of death from his pulpit. When his contract expired, we got Reverend Lanier. I was proud to live in Coldwood. According to the West Virginia history books, no one had ever lived in the valleys and hills of McDowell County before we came to dig out the coal. Up until the early 19th century, Cherokee tribes occasionally hunted in the area, but found the terrain otherwise too rugged and uninviting. Once, when I was 8 years old, I found a stone arrowhead embedded in the stump of an ancient oak tree up on the mountain behind my house. My mother said a deer must have been lucky some long ago day. That's a good opportunity there to practice inferring. What can you infer she meant by that? I was so inspired by my find that I invented an Indian tribe, the Coal-Hickens, and convinced the boys I played with, Roy, Lee, Odell, Tony, and Sherman, that it had really existed. They joined me in streaking our faces with berry juice and sticking chicken feathers in our hair. For days afterward, our little tribe of savages formed raiding parties and conducted massacres throughout Colwood. We surrounded the clubhouse and with birch branch bows and invisible arrows picked off the single miners who lived there as they came in from work. To indulge us, some of them even fell down with right convincingly on the clubhouse's vast manicured lawn. When we set up an ambush at the Tipple Gate, the miners going on shift got into the spirit of things, whooping and returning our imaginary fire. My father observed this from his office by the Tipple and came out to restore order. Although the Coal-Hickens escaped into the hills, their chief was reminded at the supper table that night that the mine was for work and not play. When we ambushed some older boys, my brother Jim among them, who were playing cowboys up in the mountains, a great mock battle ensued until Tony, up in the tree for a better line of sight, stepped on a rotted branch and fell and broke his arm. I organized the construction of a litter out of branches, and we bore the great warrior home. Okay, have you ever had an injury when you were playing and having a good time with your friends outside? Have you ever broken your arm or cut your leg or had an injury? So if you have, then you can relate to this situation when you got caught up in having so much fun that someone ended up getting hurt accidentally. So let's go ahead and keep reading. The company doctor, Doc Lassiter, drove to Tony's house in his ancient Packard and came inside. When he caught sight of us, still in our feathers and war paint, Doc said he was the heap big medicine man. Doc set Tony's arm and put it in a cast. I remember still what I wrote on it. Tony, next time, pick a better tree. Tony's Italian immigrant father was killed in the mine that same year. He and his mother left, and we never heard from them again. This did not seem unusual to me. A Colwood family required a father, one who worked for the company. The company and Colwood were one and the same. I learned most of what I knew about Colwood history in my parents' early years at the kitchen table after the supper dishes were cleared. That was when Mom had herself a cup of coffee and Dad a glass of milk. And if they weren't arguing about one thing or the other, they would talk about the town and the people in it, what was going on at the mine, what had been said at the last women's club meeting, and sometimes little stories about how things used to be. Brother Jim usually got bored and asked to be excused, but I always stayed, fascinated by their tales. Mr. George L. Carter, the founder of Colwood, came in on the back of a mule in 1887, finding nothing but wilderness, and after he dug a little, one of the richest seams of bituminous coal in the world. Seeking his fortune, Mr. Carter bought the land from its absentee owners and began construction of a mine. He also built houses, school buildings, churches, a company store, a bakery, and an ice house. He hired a doctor and a dentist and provided their service to his miners and their families for free. As the years passed and his coal company prospered, Mr. Carter had concrete sidewalks poured, the streets paved, and the town fenced to keep cows from roaming the streets. Mr. Carter wanted his miners to have a decent place to live, but in return, he asked for a decent day's work. Colwood was, after all, a place for work, above all else, hard, bruising, filthy, and sometimes deadly work.